So more directly, as I begin to talk about Texas Freedom Colonies and what they are, I want to make sure I contextualize them for you and situate them in a broader history of African American intentional community building. To be clear, not institutions or places where we were pushed, not places we lived in by default, but places we purposefully developed and built. What's significant about Texas Freedom Colonies is that in several instances, we're talking about settlements that Thad Sitton and James Conrad discuss in Freedom Colonies, Independent Black Texans in the Time of Jim Crow, that they characterize as dispersed communities, settlements. Southerners often call them places unplatted and unincorporated, individually unified only by a church and school and residents' collective belief that a community existed. Freedom Colonies emerged from 1865 to 1920, from the point at which we speak today of our emancipation here in Texas. But prior to that, the relationship between accumulating land and enslavement and founding Texas are important to note as well. Because for every 80 acres, or rather for every enslaved person that a new settler of Texas brought with them in the 1820s and 30s, they accumulated an additional 80 acres of land. While conversely, once we were emancipated in 1865, due to the black codes which are passed by the state legislature, we were not even able to take advantage of publicly available land to homestead. So we have this steady behind the eight ball, so to speak, situation, which is why it's so notable that in 1870 we owned 1% of all farmland in Texas, and by 1910 rather, we owned 31% of all farmland in Texas. So we have this not only coming over the threshold of emancipation, but being institutionally by our own government inhibited from accumulation of land and overcoming those odds. So we have on our map 357 dots, and the work of the Texas Freedom Colonies Project and my own individual research is to find out what happened to them. So if you could imagine 357 of a list of 557 places. That means we're trying to understand what was the original boundary of all of those places, how many people still live there, how many people can say that they're still descended from those places. That is the work of the Texas Freedom Colonies Project. So in my mind, when people say how many still exist, I always say every single one of them still exists. Well, what if no one lives there anymore? They exist in the imagination, they exist on homecoming when people come to gather there by the hundreds. They exist when people return to check on their family's property or even to move back into that property. And so we have an inheritance in these places. And it's up to descendants and African Americans to think through how we want to claim and make the most of that inheritance. And in that way, I would say every one of them still exists. But what the idea or the concept of a freedom colony is today, and what I argue in my work, is the idea of free black space. That is a free black imaginary or an ideal that I think in many ways, as we confront problems with the criminal justice system, as we confront, as I keep saying, a lack of investment in our communities, a lot of flight from our communities, as we're confronting these perennial problems that challenge us, we're finding that there's a lot of knowledge from our ancestors when they began these communities, when they founded them out of nothing, that we can use today to counteract efforts to decimate black communities. And so I really operate under the idea of Sankofa. It's a symbol I use to symbolize freedom colonies and the work I do. And it's about looking at the past before you move forward. So it's about looking critically at the past, not that it was perfect, not that it was an ideal, but what is it we can take from their approaches to cooperative economics? What can we learn from the ways that they recycle building materials to create institutions? What is it we can learn from their problem solving and the ways that they interacted and cared for one another that we can apply now to addressing all of our biggest challenges. That's, to me, what the future of Freedom Colonies is looking at how we can apply those best practices to building stronger and better communities today.